everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today, Solidarity Fridays. We were joined again by Will Hall. How you doing, Will?
Good to be back.
Yeah. So, been only a few minutes, but a week for everybody else. So, I'm excited to continue this conversation because there's some really interesting points that you've raised. One, so I really want to come back to this medicalization thing. And, you know, I don't know that we've really challenged the paradigm here enough for people to kind of understand where we're going. So everybody's saying like, okay, cool. Like I can go to the doctor, I pay them money, I get whatever I need over there. And that's how doctors work. In a lot of ways, that's how therapy works too. You make a phone call. Hopefully your insurance covers it. Mine doesn't because I don't have any, but I would love it if it did. And then you go get some service and for whatever your indication is. Like, I hope, do either of you know offhand if people need a prescription to get therapy with some prescriptions or insurance packages, or is it always included in their insurance?
Usually your first session is an assessment. And then the first session, the therapist has to report to the insurance company what your diagnosis is and what the treatment is.
Okay. So people might only get like 4 to 5 sessions a year, if that, on their insurance, which is pretty wild to consider. And that's kind of the system, this kind of garbage that we're dealing with now. Like I have no problem saying like healthcare in America right now is not anywhere close to ideal. And in a lot of cases, quite problematic. And so we start there as the baseline. Like people can sometimes get access to mental health care services. Not always though. I know I can't. I wish I could. But how do we want to start then critiquing like mental or psychic situations as how do we want to exclude that from a medical model? Like I can see a lot of problems with saying, okay, we've got this big book and you have to fit into this big book so that we can treat you at DSM. And then, you know, then we need to bill against insurance based on what we diagnosed you with and how we treated you. Like I see problems with that. Like can either of you kind of critique that for me just briefly as from an insider point of view?
I can address it. Like let's look at homelessness, for example. If you experience homelessness and you walk into an agency, and let's say you're in a part of the country that's got good funding, okay? You walk into the agency, you sit down, you say, I experience homelessness. And then they start a process to maybe find you short-term housing, temporary shelter. They maybe line you up with some free dental care, some medical care, something. I'm imagining, obviously it's an ideal, I'm imagining. And then, you know, you might get some transitional housing. You might be able to get connected to some kind of supported housing, employment. There's all kinds of different services. I used to live in Portland, and relatively speaking, the homeless services are really good. Now imagine that you're homeless and you walk in and you say, I'm homeless. And they say, well, first of all, we have to do a mental health diagnosis of you to see if you meet the criteria for domicile deficiency disorder. Wait, we just scored you on this chart. You're perfectly capable of working. You're perfectly capable of finding your own money. So we're not going to give you any services because you didn't meet this diagnosis. We just don't look at it that way. If you have the need, you give the service, right? Same thing with domestic violence. So let's say that you're someone who your boyfriend beats you up and you've been trying to get out for a long time, but you haven't got family to stay with. You haven't got any savings. And you're done. You're ready to get out, and you get your kids. You go and you say, "Look, my boyfriend's beating me up. I'm terrified of him. I know I don't have anywhere else to stay." And if again, ideal situation, I'm describing the service, the resources available, you get access to shelter. You find a place to stay. Imagine that woman comes in, or it could be a man, but let's imagine the woman comes in. And now, okay, well, we have to diagnose you to make sure if you don't have, we have to make sure you meet the criteria for masochistic personality disorder. Because you've been staying with this guy for years and years while he's beating you up. And obviously there's some kind of psychological problem with you. Just like so-and-so is in a society where there's plenty of jobs. You can get a job at McDonald's. You can get plenty of jobs available. There's plenty of places. You can get roommates. You can live with people. He obviously has psychological problems. That's why he's homeless. Now, we would consider both of those scenarios just be completely unthinkable, right? But what if I told you that actually the geniuses at the DSM, which is a political process, it's not they don't evaluate which is the best science. They just debate politically. These are the geniuses who gave us homosexuality is a disease, right? Being gay was a mental disorder for most of the history of the DSM. They wanted to come up with something called masochistic personality disorder because there are women who go back to their abusive boyfriends. Now, I think that it's pretty obvious you don't need a mental disorder to explain why someone would go back to their abusive boyfriend. There are many, many, many ways of understanding that. You don't have to locate the problem in the person's brain. So but the guys of the DSM, they really wanted to do that. And there actually was a pushback, the women's movement, especially in the psychiatric survivor movement, pushback against that idea of masochistic personality disorder. There's something wrong with you in your psychology and your personality. So what I would say is that we don't actually need any diagnosis for providing any services, because if a guy is homeless or a woman is homeless, whoever is homeless, and they decide, well, I really just need to get my nutrition back on track. And now that I'm eating 3 square meals a day, I'm able to work and I'm able to, if they figure out that's what the solution is, okay. If somebody else who's homeless realizes, I had a crisis of faith. My parents have a big conflict about religion. They divorced. I believe that there was no God. I went back. I did communion. I'm totally connected back with my church. Now I feel inspired to get a home and a job. We say, okay, that's your explanation. People have totally different explanations for their experience. We support them both equally with services, and we let them figure it out any way that's possible. If someone says, I'm no longer homeless because I found God, you don't tell that person, oh, no. You had successful treatment for your domicile deficiency disorder. And because your domicile deficiency disorder is now under control, that's what allowed you to get back on the track to having a home. So the idea that diagnosis is even part of the picture isn't necessary. Well, guess what? Every mental illness is exactly the same way. There are many, many, many different explanations why someone would have an experience with attention, that they can't focus, for example, or have an experience with depression, that it's hard for them to get out of bed. And the people that I've worked with, my experience, it's not one size fits all. If you say, well, alcoholism is caused by the alcoholism disease and the alcohol gene, a lot of people believe that, but actually the science doesn't back it up. It just doesn't back it up. And people who recover from alcoholism, as they define it, will tell you many, many different reasons why they got into drinking and how they got out of it. There's no one, I just was exposed to the alcoholism bacillus and it grew in my body. And then I was, infected by alcoholism bacteria. And then I took an anti-alcoholism antibiotic, got rid of the bacteria, and now I don't have alcoholism. Well, that's the framework for thinking about mental disorders, is that you have a chemical imbalance, or now you have a neural connectivity dysregulation. We give you a chemical and we've fixed you, and then now you're back on track. Well, guess what? There's no science behind that. That's just, again, it's what William James called medical materialism. It's a huge misunderstanding about how drugs work, because drugs are drugs. I don't believe in psychedelic exceptionalism. I don't believe in psychiatric drug exceptionalism. Drugs are drugs. There's no exceptionalism for drugs. If they change your consciousness, they're getting you high in one way or another. And that is what is either beneficial or non-beneficial to you based on your experience. So many people have different reasons why they get into what gets called depression. In fact, have a conversation with your friends about their depression. You talk to 3 people about depression. Whoa, guess what? 3 different people are going to tell you 3 different experiences of depression. One person has been depressed their whole life. One person got depressed after they broke up with their boyfriend. Another person got depressed when they moved into a new house that had black mold. So the idea that we can just suddenly imprison everybody in this conceptual framework is just false. It disrespects the individual. And it's worse because it channels you in a direction of one kind of treatment that people are making lots of money off of. And then, even worse, once you're on the antidepressant, or you're taking the antipsychotic, or you're taking the Depakote or the lithium or whatever it is for bipolar, if you then decide, well, actually, I want to try and come off of it, you're surrounded by all these messages. They're saying, no, that's irresponsible because your brain chemistry needs these drugs and you're going to get worse. And there's no way forward except without these drugs. And we're giving people these false messages that are keeping them continuing to take treatments that they experience as not helping and that could be harmful to them. So we're committing this social-wide crime of enforcing chemical and medical induced injury to people's brains and bodies because we're not saying to them, oh, lithium doesn't work for you. You don't like the side effects. You're worried about the negatives, the downsides of lithium. Here's some other possibilities you can try. Did you know that there's a whole community of people worldwide diagnosed with bipolar who don't take lithium, don't take any drug? How have they figured out how to do it? That's what we should be researching, not how does lithium affect the brains of rats or these randomized controlled experiments that are very narrow that show that, yeah, if you dose someone with lithium, which is a sedating drug, if you dose someone with lithium, they're not going to go into a manic state. That research doesn't help us understand the complexity of what is experienced as mania and experienced as bipolar. We're not researching all those people that are doing really well without taking medications. Why aren't we researching that? Well, for exactly the same reason that we've been talking about this bias in psychedelic science. Certain kinds of research aren't supported, and it's not because of the science behind it, it's because of the profit motive, it's the role of industry, it's the investment of careers. So the conversation is a big one to have about mental illnesses, but I feel like if people need counseling, they should have counseling. Radical concept, I know, but they should have counseling. If you need housing, you should have housing. If you need a place to go because your boyfriend or your husband or whoever it is beating you up, let's give you a place to go. And I don't think it's that complicated. And then someone should be with you in the process of discovering, based on options, what your pathway forward is. And the science is totally solid on this perspective that I'm presenting. There's a wonderful research that was done in New York City where they took people that met the criteria for clinical depression. These were people who were depressed. They didn't give them medication. What they gave them was micro loans for starting cooperative businesses. And because the people were getting loans and they were getting support and they were getting the opportunity to succeed economically, their lives changed. They were able to lift themselves out of poverty a little bit. And guess what? Their scores in the depression tests go down. Depression is completely socially constructed. Individual people have different experiences. Look, I'm not going to tell you that if you don't get vitamin D, you're not going to get depressed. Obviously, there's biological factors involved here. And there's certainly people who want to have a biological understanding or a holistic understanding, and that's absolutely fine. The problem is that the industry of psychiatry is enforcing one interpretation that excludes the other interpretations. And I think we have to be honest that lots of different possibilities are there to what causes depression, what can alleviate depression, and actually even what the experience of depression is. Now, what I would like to see is psychedelic science have that same kind of honesty. When I go to a psychedelic, I've only been to a few. I was invited to the ICPR a couple of weeks ago, and I hear people talk about treatment for depression, this treatment for depression, that. Why aren't we talking about the complex questions involved with that? I mean, one of the things that I think, and you guys probably know more about this than I do, but right now, psilocybin is being presented as something to offer people at the end of their lives to ease the dying process. And this is just showing great promise. I agree with that. I think it should be available to people. I think it does have promise. But the problem is, how do you diagnose that? How do you prescribe it? Because is it an illness to be facing death and be terrified and to be agitated in your bed in the hospice and be confused and overwhelmed? Is that really an illness? Is that in the DSM? You're going to give all these people anxiety disorder diagnosis in order to justify prescribing them psilocybin? No. What's happened is that psychedelic science has kind of gone into an area where, psychedelics can be really helpful to people, and we don't actually have a way to medicalize this. How do you medicalize end of life? I mean, it's a natural human thing. It's like medicalizing pregnancy and childbirth. Oh, wait, actually, doctors did that. They will medicalize anything. They medicalized pregnancy and childbirth for many, many years and said midwives get out and no, you can't have home births and all this kind of thing. And now we've overcome that. but through a movement. It took the women's movement to challenge that. And hopefully there'll be pushback against people, because they're probably the insurance companies, et cetera, are going to say, well, if we want to have psychedelics for people in hospices and we have to diagnose them with generalized anxiety disorder or end of life terminal agitation or something like that, and there's going to be people that push back and say, no, we should make psychedelics available to people with caring counseling at the end of life, if that's what they choose, without having to tell them that we're treating you for this disease that you have. So, I mean, it's a big conversation. I hope this is opening up where I think this should be going, is a more honest understanding of where, if these substances can be useful, great, but we don't have to provide them as treatments and prescriptions for illnesses.
Yeah, and just your example there of, prescribing psilocybin to somebody that's dying. I mean, this came up when one of our earlier episodes with Dr. Catherine McLean, who was at Johns Hopkins with some of this, and she brought up this great point. How do you know when you're going to die, right? And should that be available to anybody at any part of their life? And just thinking about my own experience and story, like I almost died when I was 16, right?
Yeah. I almost died when I was 16 too, Kyle. We should talk about that.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that. But, nobody knows. And to be able to have an experience, if this is showing promise that it's helping you to develop a relationship with death, absolutely. I think that's helpful at any point in your life, until, besides waiting till you get to the end of your life and you're diagnosed with some sort of terminal illness. And then It's like, okay, you meet criteria now, versus like, what would be different if you had that experience beforehand and then, you have some sort of diagnosis, something goes on, and maybe you already started to develop a relationship with death where you're able to confront that earlier on.
A very good point. I mean, it makes me think of like MDMA, for example, the people who are having successful treatment with MDMA psychotherapy, they aren't just reporting, oh, my depression is down. They're reporting all these wonderful benefits of MDMA. Why should we wait until you have a diagnosis of PTSD to give access to someone to MDMA if they want to experience those benefits as well? If they want people who are having the experiences of psychedelics are not having the experiences of disease treatment. They're having the experiences of psychedelics, which are all these can be for many people very positive. So why are we gatekeeping the access? And if we don't gatekeep the access, then we have to admit that actually it's not a disease treatment. It's actually something that many people find beneficial and some people don't. Now, of course, the other direction of it, Kyle, do you want to live in a world 20 years from now where there's a giant industry of people saying, don't be afraid of death, don't be afraid of death on billboards, take a psychedelic, don't be afraid of death, and you should stop being afraid of death. And, fear of death is no longer needed. And do you want people to, under a legal commercial regime, to be promoting?
That's really fascinating, Will. Like, I can see that like 10 years out, like that would totally be where we're at. And it feels really like Huxleyan or Orwellian. In a way, like
capitalism
death,
just says,
no problem. Take this thing.
What's the sellable product? Oh, a product that treats death.
Right.
There's no discrimination. Anything that's sellable will be sold under capitalism.
But I think if we were really honest about our experiences and just didn't highlight those positive attributes, I mean, I don't know how many times I've had those experiences where I confronted death and I had this near-death experience. I talk about, being able to confront death. I mean, I'm honest. I'm still afraid of it. It doesn't cure me of my death fear.
Nobody's paying you to advertise their end fear of death. So
it doesn't sell, right?
Right, exactly. All that nuance, all that honesty is going to be lost when we start having these products. And we're not really in the realm of just fantasy here. This is very possible, especially when you start to move into apocalyptic kind of scenarios where the society gets very ugly. And then people want to check out and they want to escape and they want to deal with extreme suffering. And you've got virtual reality and you've got psychedelics. So how do we kind of make sure that people have access, but also make sure that it's not twisted and distorted by a hyper commercialization? The only way you can do that is through state and government regulation that empowers communities. And the only way you can have that effective state, government, federal regulation is if you actually have an honest regulatory apparatus. You're not going to get that under neoliberal capitalism It's just not going to happen. So we're headed in some very dangerous directions, and hopefully we can wake up to it.
Let's kind of define that term, Will.
Right.
Neoliberalism.
I'm throwing left.
We throw it around a lot, but people are definitely left out because they don't have a clean definition of that.
Everything should have a market solution. We don't want to actually have a national health service in England. We want to have different doctors that people can pay for privately, and they can purchase their medical care in the marketplace. It's the idea that capitalism is wedded to liberal society of freedoms and free market, and reducing regulations, pushing back unions, that the free market should rule, that the market is the most efficient way of organizing society, and everything should fit into that framework. Our news should be organized by the marketplace. Our healthcare should be organized by the marketplace. Our water should be organized by, it's so inefficient to have a public utility around water. Let's sell it off and then just have these much more efficient private companies, that'll trim the fat, and they'll operate more effectively, and let them run our water supply. Or education. Yeah, just pay for your tutoring and whatever classes you want your kids to have. Neoliberalism says that capitalism is some kind of better way to organize, and it's been winning. And we're going to have less taxation because we want to have less services, because it's actually much more efficient for the market to be providing services. Now, it's a disaster. It's led the rollbacks of taxation that started after Reagan was elected have led to gradually more and more of a lower tax base on corporations and individuals, which has led to incredible levels of massive inequality and tremendous immiseration of the population in the US. And child poverty hasn't been eradicated. We've had the war on drugs that's gone up at the same time, rather than addressing poverty in our society. So I'm sorry I'm using that as a jargon, but it's basically a way of saying that, look, capitalism isn't the answer for everything. We have to have a certain realm. I'm not against people starting their own businesses and having their own, reaping some of the benefits of their own work and investment and the efforts that they do. But that has to be very curtailed. It has to be really limited because of the negative consequences that it can have. You just can't hire the neighbor's kid to work for you in your office. This because you'll exploit the kid, and there has to be some kind of government intervention that steps in and says, sorry, the greed model isn't how we want to run our society. I was a big supporter of the Bernie Sanders campaign. I don't think there was a big conversation about psychedelics going on in the Bernie Sanders campaign. I don't think that there were Bernie Sanders supporters coming to psychedelic conferences talking about how we have to remake society and put all these pieces together. But I think that's what we should be doing. The conversation about what society do we want to live in as an alternative to capitalism runs the show, which hasn't worked, needs to be brought into the communities around psychedelic science and around what about access to these drugs. This is the future we're talking about.
Right. It's a daunting thing, like being psychedelics today and not like riseuptoday.com. Like it's kind of hard to have these conversations, but we are on track for a pretty solid extinction event. Or at least, we are accelerating the rate at which species go extinct. This is what a lot of folks are calling the sixth great extinction period. And it's because of humans. It's not just because of climate change that's, endogenous. It's like, this is us doing stuff to the world. We're over harvesting, we're overusing.
Well, I'd be careful about the we, because it's the colonial dominant countries that have been the ones that have been massively consuming. And then in those countries, they haven't been, there wasn't, as far as I know, a big referendum among the US population about whether we should protect wilderness or exploit it. It's been pretty much, capitalism's been kind of run rampant. I think if you polled people, they would support protecting the environment. They would support, and they do. The polls show that people support really strong programs and change for addressing the climate crisis and the extinction crisis. So societies aren't organized democratically.
Thanks for reminding me of that. My talk track is always, it's not the people's fault. It's organizations. a number of levels above where they operate are the real ones to blame. It's crony capitalism, not real capitalism that we're dealing with. And we're dealing with it at a very unnatural scale.
I would say it's not, in a sense, it's not even capitalism. Capitalism ended with the Great Depression and World War II. And then after World War II, you have the New Deal Keynesian model, which puts the state in a huge, huge central position. It's not just industrials doing whatever they want to do. You got this massive regulation, and you've got massive taxation, you've got massive investment. Government is through military spending and through all kinds of contracts and through the control with the Federal Reserve and the money supply. The state plays a central role in really kind of planning the capitalist economy, but it's not planned in a socialist sense. It's more planned in a capitalist sense. We have kind of like a state capitalism. And that's why I think it's so important to look at the way in which we're really going far afield from the psychedelics world. But I think it's important to look at the way our democracy has failed. You know, we're in a democracy where you can buy votes, and it's about donors, and it's about keeping the donors happy. We just saw this with, Bernie Sanders was doing great, and then donors weren't happy about that, and Obama steps in, and then we can have that whole conversation. But really, if we want to talk about addressing a problem like depression or anxiety, or want to take a look at trauma, can we really look to psychedelic treatments in the context of pharma to answer that? Or is that dishonest? And I think it's just dishonest. I think we need to take a step back and really have the conversation and then say, well, why are people so excited to get these treatments out? Well, there's people who want, for ideological and personal reasons, they want everybody to have access to psychedelics. Psychedelics are pretty easy to get a hold of already, but there's that. But then there's a lot of people who are seeing dollar signs. There's a gold rush right now.
Totally.
And interestingly, the psychiatric world has come to the end of the road in terms of new treatments. They've come to the end of the road with the chemical imbalance theory. And so I think that the psychiatric world and neuroscience world have rightly seen psychedelics as opening up this incredible new opportunity for this whole new horizon of expansion. And so they've jumped on board with it. So the people who are pro-psychedelic, plus the people who want to make lots of money, plus the people who want to reinvigorate neuroscience and psychiatry, have kind of formed together into this alliance that's pushing psychedelics into the mainstream, which is quite shocking. If 20 years ago you said this was going to happen, I think people would have laughed at you. But it's happening. It's happening.
So I was re-listening to some Grof recently to prepare for our screening we did the other day. I listened to the 3-hour interview Stan Grof did with Tim Ferriss about Stan's work, kind of like a big overview of Stan's work. And Stan recently told a friend of ours that it was his best representation of Stan's work. So I thought that was really interesting. And Stan talked about how he's very disappointed in the way that psychedelic science is going forward, because he came up as like a Freudian, like, where are these, what is the cause of trauma? So cool, you're treating trauma, DSM trauma. You're not necessarily going, okay, where did this particular neurosis come from? Like, where did this particular behavior come from? He's calling it etiology. And he really wishes more people would do kind of like basic etiology research, as opposed to, Carhart-Harris style neuroimaging, which doesn't really tell us anything related to our lived experience.
Exactly. The etiology is disease etiology. But I mean, Grof, for all of his problems, and we can talk about them. I have some thoughts about that. Yeah, he's into the phenomenology. He's into the actual consciousness. What are the symbols? What's the experience? What's the emotions? And the biography of the individual, and then the idea that there's this collective biography that we tap in. Yeah, the Freudians and psychoanalysis start to look pretty attractive when you're stuck with rats and MRIs and, measuring brain neurons. I mean, it starts to be much more sophisticated, even though it has its own limitations. But that's very interesting that the juggernaut of psychedelic science and the gold rush is able to just kind of kick aside its founding father he's had zero impact on the direction of psychedelic science because no one's. Yeah,
that's why we're here. Is Grof wasn't talked about enough, and we wanted him talked about more.
He's seen as a liability. I mean, the psychedelic science people like Thomas Insel, who used to be NIMH, they really just want to forget about that the 60s and 70s and the human potential movement ever happened. They just want to start from labs and drugs and the new research going forward. And I think we need to go in the opposite direction. It's interesting that you brought up Grof because, Grof is, I think, rightly credited for a lot of really positive things. I love the idea of the inner healer that you work with in breath work, the idea that it's not the breath work, it's not even the facilitator, it's something inside of you that has a wisdom and that has a capacity, and that the breath work and the psychedelics let you tap into it. That's a wonderful, wonderful concept. That's something I really appreciate. And also I think that, Grof has been really helpful in helping some people understand birth trauma, which I think is a real thing, and to make connections with traumatic events that have happened in their childhoods that can linger and carry forward, and then see them as needing to be addressed psychologically by being in touch with emotional parts of ourselves that we're not in touch with, and then maybe going back into our relationships with our families and trying to resolve that and work with that. So there's a lot of really good things, I think, in Grof's work. One of the thing that I think is most beneficial has been the idea of spiritual emergence, that Grof has really helped to validate that, wait a second, we are calling this psychosis, locking people up, labeling them, pushing them to the margins of society, requiring them to take drugs. But some of these people are having spiritual experiences and they need to be respected and not drugged. And I think that's great, but he's only half right. Because the problem that I have, and Kyle and I have talked about this as well, is that who decides which is which? And for me, you're having a spiritual experience if you say you're having a spiritual experience. I mean, it's about respecting someone's own individual self-understanding. And it's just simply not true that there are people out there who are just schizophrenic and psychotic, and there's nothing that can be done for them except give them meds. There are many, many people. I mean, I was told I was going to take meds for the rest of my life. I was diagnosed with schizophrenia. I don't take meds. I was put on disability. I was on disability for 15 years. I came off of disability. It's a whole movement of people that are saying, wait a second, our experiences, our lives don't match up with this sorting process of those are the real crazy ones and these are the spiritual emergence ones. That instead we need to approach everyone with the sensitivity and warmth and openness to possibility, because it's a big self-fulfilling prophecy. You tell someone, hey, you're having a spiritual emergence. You're a shaman. You're connecting with your psychic powers. Like, wow, that's really uplifting.
I think the term's really problematic itself. Like, I think we need to adjust that term.
Well, you tell somebody they're a shaman and it's uplifting. You tell someone they're schizophrenic, it's like casting a spell on them and putting them down. But in terms of the spiritual emergence, it is true that culturally, the people who become spirit healers, medicine people, shamans, have an initiatory crisis. They don't just wake up one morning and say, hey, I want to have a nice, 6-figure income and live in the suburbs. I'm going to go to med school. They have a crisis. They have an illness themselves. And that's what teaches them as wounded healers how to help others. And it's often psychosis. It looks like psychosis. I wouldn't call it psychosis. So there's something fundamental about humans going through their own crisis, coming out of it, and then being able to help other people. And I think, maybe we need a different term than spiritual emergence, but I work with lots of people who, by embracing, wow, I hear voices, or I have psychic sensitivities, or wow, maybe I am connecting with my past lives, by embracing that rather than fighting against it. Oh, I'm schizophrenic, I'm paranoid. It really helps them to move to a better place. And to me, it's just about practicality. What helps people? I don't think it helps people to sort them and say, no, you really are psychotic, so we don't want to let you into our breath work session. We don't want you messing with psychedelics because you really are schizophrenic. Because there really isn't any research or assessment or tests that you can do that will prove that someone is in one group or another. I mean, before COVID, we were doing breath work. I was assisting Nita Gage and others doing breath work. as part of the Esalen R.D. Laing seminar, and we had many people who had a diagnosis of schizophrenia or psychosis and bipolar, and we sat down with them just like we sat down with everyone to make sure it's the right time for them. But we didn't have like a wall that says you're psychotic, therefore you get special different. It was a more individualized thing. And I think that Grof has done a lot of damage by enforcing this idea that there are the truly psychotic, the truly schizophrenic, the truly bipolar who should never do psychedelics. And no, it's a much more individual thing. I mean, some people are very sensitive. You don't need a big dose of psychedelics to have a meaningful experience. You can do even breath work. But I think the idea that we're excluding people based on a label is very bigoted. And we're going to look back on it and see it as just a terrible kind of hurtful discrimination. I've seen meditation retreats. The Cuenca retreats do this. Many retreats do this. They ask you, do you have a mental illness? Do you have a mental health problem in the interview? And then if you have a history, they won't let you come. And I'm like, look, it's a little bit more, it has to be individual. And there's other retreat centers that are wonderful and don't ask those kinds of questions. Now, does that mean that I'm saying, well, sometimes people don't freak out? They take psychedelics and they have a psychotic break, or what we would call of course they do. Do people go to meditation retreats and sometimes the same thing happen? They freak out and they do. But the way to deal with that is not to try and predict it and exclude people based on these arbitrary criteria, but to be really sensitive to people and develop what in the disability rights movement is called universal design. You create a society where it includes everyone. You don't have some places that have wheelchair ramps and some places that don't. You create universal design. You create a welcoming context for everyone. And then everyone is going to benefit. When you have curb cuts and ramps, people with rolling luggage are benefited. People with baby strollers are benefited. So if we have sensitivity to everyone and the possibility that anyone can go into an altered state under the right kind of stress, you don't have to have a diagnosis or some gene that they haven't actually found. If you have sensitivity and compassion for everyone, everyone's going to benefit. And, even with the strictest, do you have a family history? Have you ever been hospitalized? Psychedelics are unpredictable. We should be realistic about that. You're doing a big thing. It's like going on a solo wilderness. You want to do a solo wilderness 3-day? Yeah, some people want to do a solo wilderness 3-day. Well, worst case scenario, you could fall and get really seriously injured. And, I don't think psychedelics under the right set and setting are that dangerous, but I do think there's an unpredictable element. And what I've seen, like with ketamine therapy, the off-label ketamine therapy, is that, people are having, crisis after having ketamine experiences, and then they just get dropped. Oh, well, that person had a pre-existing condition of schizophrenia, or that person was bipolar. That explains why they're having an experience. They're having a difficult experience. You need to be prepared and trained to stand with them and take responsibility for the fact that you're doing a risky treatment with people. Everyone should have a place to go if things go difficult in a psychedelic experience, rather than just saying, okay, this person, is really, really freaking out. Therefore, they must have had an underlying bipolar. Therefore, we're just going to kind of let the medical, hospital, police sort of handle that and wash our hands of it and then do more screening next time. We need to wake up to the mistreatment of people with psychosis and bipolar and schizophrenia diagnosis. And that awareness isn't in the psychedelic world. And unfortunately, Stan Grof has been kind of part of that by creating this wall between the truly psychotic and then the spiritual. The biggest difference that I see between those two is often just class background. The people who have the money for therapy and they have the education to read books by Joseph Campbell, they sort of have a spiritual emergence framework. But then people who come from a less education or less of a class privilege background, they aren't seen as potentially having a spiritual emergence. So I really think we need to rethink that rather than reproduce it in the psychedelic therapy world.
Right. And a mutual friend of ours was telling me, I don't know how true this is, but they were talking to somebody that was chatting with Grof, and he started to backtrack actually on that and viewing people that would be labeled as psychotic, schizophrenia, actually might have benefit from these experiences like longer term as they work through it.
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
And so, I'm not too sure.
And he was treating people like that in Prague. Like he was treating people with pretty serious disorders that like today, like culture is not really including in the psychedelic milieu, I guess.
But in the
sorry, Kyle.
But in the teaching, in Grof's teaching, and the way that the whole breathwork, the way the whole breathwork is being taught, there's this kind of wall. It's like an either or kind of wall.
I totally agree, Will. But like what I'm seeing is like, so like given all the baggage, like we've got a lot of cultural baggage around this stuff. Like I've got some family friends that went through some really gnarly, really wild bipolar stuff. And like the stories are, not far from like what Hunter Thompson might look like on like a real bad day. And like, how do I, and people in the mental health field that, in a lot of ways, they are hamstrung by their licensing boards on how they're supposed to interact, and they're putting their license and profession at risk. It's just a really big deal. So like the deck stacked against them, and how do we even try to open this up? So like, say for example, someone was getting screened to go through like a paid, let's not even call it like a trial. So you're paying the therapist and whoever else, the psychiatrist, to prescribe the drugs, and you're paying, but then you had like 2 years ago, you were hospitalized for like either bipolar or schizophrenia or something. And then how do you communicate that? Or like, how would you have that discussion with
the main problem that I see is, are we going to do mass produced medicine, or are we going to do individualized medicine? Is it about the relationship and about listening, or are we just going to create algorithms and protocols for mass production? Because the whole capitalist framework is about everything's a factory, you just mass produce everything. You cannot get around the individual. You have to respect and listen to the individual. If someone comes to me and they say, Will, I've heard all this stuff about psilocybin. I really want to do psilocybin. I read Michael Pollan's book. I'm not going to ask them, have you been diagnosed with schizophrenia? Because for me, it's not relevant to whether or not they'll be benefiting from psilocybin, because some of the people who have been diagnosed with schizophrenia, because they've dealt with terrifying experiences, are more able to deal with and assess and work with and encounter the extremes of a psychedelic. So it works in both directions. But I will ask them questions like, well, tell me about your life. How stable is your life right now? I want to find out, are they running away from something? Is there something when was the last time you had a big stress? When was the last time you had a big emotional shock? How did you deal with it? How much support do you have? What would happen if you became suicidal? Have you been suicidal in the past? Have you ever dealt with extreme terror? How did you deal with it? How would you respond? How did you take care of yourself? Now I have a sense of whether someone is ready or capable or open enough to do something as potentially risky as a big psychedelic experience. But I might ask them the same question if I was going on a 3-day camping trip with them in the wilderness. How do you deal with suddenly the weather changes and we forgot some crucial medicine and we're 2 days out and we don't know what to do, and then everybody's fighting with each other? I mean, there's all kinds of things that can come up in life. And I might want to do screening, but I'm not going to screen around bigoted assumptions of labels. If someone has a horrendous bipolar history, I don't make assumptions about where they are now. If someone has a horrendous history, homeless, I don't make assumptions. They could be a very successful person in society, even though 2 years ago they were extremely homeless. We're human beings. We change. And the problem is when we're trying to mass produce and come up with algorithms and just have check boxes so that we know that we're doing the right thing, that we overlook that individual. And can that be done in a mass-produced way? Can you just teach one class in a psychotherapy training program and you're done? No. Human beings are more complicated than that. So if you're asking the question, raising the question of like the licensing restrictions, there's a lot of real problems with the way that psychotherapy is taught. And so that's why, part of my practice as a therapist is I'm also in part of this broader movement. I'm part of this patients movement. I'm part of the human rights movement and advocacy movement, because we're trying to get changes in society. There need to be support groups that people can go to, for example. There need to be places that people can go if they want to come off of medications. And if psychotherapists are puzzled and having a hard time with a client, they need support. They need options. They need resources in society. Someone comes to them and is suffering from poverty and homelessness, talk therapy might be helpful, but a referral to something in the community, a resource in the community is also going to be. So any therapist who really works with a broad spectrum of people and sees people who suffer poverty, they know that there need to be social changes. They know that they can't just work on the person's cognitive behavioral messages and, beliefs and get them more able to deal with the job market. They know that there have to be social change. And so we need therapists who are honest to start joining their voices in the kinds of changes that we need to make. And if we're not there yet, I would at least like to see the people in the psychedelics world at least raising these questions, at least starting to have the conversation, because it's just not really happening. People aren't really questioning all this. And I think that it's starting to happen, but we need a lot more of it.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Will. And something that I've often raised up is kind of like the container. I think you're kind of pointing to that. It's like, mass produce algorithm, you're not going to be able to contain somebody possibly if they have some sort of big experience, right? Versus taking this more personalized approach and being like, this person might have had this past, but guess what? We're creating a container for you to move through that, and I'll be with you. Versus we have this clinic and we just need to run people through. We can't tolerate any people having a big experience, right? So, I think that's part of it about scaling up and then excluding those people is can they stick with those people if they open up? And probably the chances is no with the way, some of that medicalization is happening.
Well, let's be realistic. I mean, so let's say you have a clinic and you want to do psychedelic psilocybin therapy and not just working with microdoses, and you screen everybody. Do they have a history? Have they ever been hospitalized? Do they have a family history? There's still going to be people that are going to come through. If you work with enough people, they're going to be people who come through and they're going to surprise you. They're going to have a big, dramatic, scary. Yep. There were no signs. There was no early warning. They're going to have big, dramatic experience. You don't have a container. You haven't got a place for them to go. You haven't got staff. So what are you going to do? Do you blame the person and you say, well, that was a schizophrenic or that was a bipolar person, and then put it on them? Or do you take responsibility? You say, look, I'm a practitioner. I can't provide the container based on my business model that I would like to. The society doesn't provide it. So I'm in a dilemma. If I'm going to honestly do psychedelic therapy with this risk, which is there, then I have to be honest about what I'm telling. I'm not going to tell everybody you'll be fine unless you're schizophrenic. That's not honest. You tell people that, look, these are unpredictable. You could have a big experience. If you ended up in a psych hospital, that would be a horrible option. Probably not everyone has a bad experience in the psych hospital, but I wouldn't want to see you do that. I wouldn't want to be the one calling 911. But what other options do we have? You see? And so you have an honest conversation with people from a harm reduction standpoint, from a basic principle of informed consent. But now the product starts to look a little bit more fuzzy. Now it's not, I have trauma. Let me go get treated from the magical spa that has the wonderful billboard with the before and after picture. I mean, that's how capitalism sells us. No one sells Coca-Cola by saying, well, it's wonderful, it tastes good, it can give you a pep, it's like refreshing, and it rots your teeth. And that's not how we do things. But that's what's needed if you want to do honest medicine or you want to be really honest about substances. So I'm not getting back to what Joe was saying. One of the things that is a misunderstanding of the psychiatric survivor movement is that somehow we're making light of the severity. I mean, it's very serious. What we call mental illness is often very extreme. I mean, I have multiple suicide attempts. I was locked up several times in a psychiatric hospital. I was in restraints. I mean, I wasn't able to feed myself. I was on disability. I mean, I'm very well, and I work with lots of people who are in very extreme suffering. But we don't need the labels, and we don't need the kind of putting people in boxes to be honest about that. And to respond effectively. We just need a certain kind of willingness to be honest about the situation. And one of the things that we need to be honest about is that fear, our fear of the other, is a big part of the equation. And so if someone comes to me and they say, Will, I hear voices, my response is, okay, what do they say? Tell me, I don't make an assumption. Other people, the person sits down, they say, I hear voices, they immediately get frightened that the person's going to be violent, or they're going to attack them, or they're going to be too much or something. And so the fear piece of the equation is extremely important. And the only way that we can overcome that is if we start to have the conversations that we're having. And so, no, you can't get a psychedelic therapy license and treat people with psilocybin and think that you're not going to ever have problems. These are unpredictable drugs. And so you have to, unpredictable substances. And so you have to kind of prepare and be honest about what you can do and what you can't do. And instead of saying, no, you're schizophrenic, therefore I'm going to go you be honest with the person. Look, you're going through a big experience. You didn't come down. You seem to be in a persistent altered state. Sometimes it's rare, but sometimes people do have that happen. It's very likely that you had some kind of trauma or inner conflict or something going on that you weren't aware of that has now been exposed. And here are some options for you. If you go to a psychiatrist, they're going to label you with schizophrenia. Don't buy it. Think critically. If you end up in the hospital, they're going to offer safety. It might not be safe. It might be even more dangerous in the hospital. So you come from a very clear harm reduction standpoint of honesty with people. And I don't think that's what's happening in psychotherapy more broadly. It's trafficking, and it's trafficking in a lot of assumptions about labels and assumptions about psychosis and assumptions about, you go to the hospital, you're going to be stabilized. No, sometimes people go to hospitals, they get put on drugs, forced on drugs, and the drugs make them worse. And they come out and they're not better, and then they just hit them with more drugs. Or you go into the hospital, you take an antidepressant, now you have a manic reaction. The manic reaction is a side effect of the antidepressant, but now they tell you, you're bipolar. Now they give you bipolar drugs. And then you just go down a rabbit hole. Now, as psychotherapists, are they honest with people about these are the risks of psychiatry and mental health? No, they aren't. And that's what needs to be happening.
Well, I wonder how many are actually educated about that whole process. It was really interesting starting to work with people and hear these stories of stepping down from the psychiatric unit and hearing the trauma that was forced upon them at times, and just how terrifying it was, and how, almost like inhumane at times it felt. And it's like, oh, wow, yeah. I didn't know that.
It's hidden away, the stigma, and it's not taught in the training. And so that's one of the things that I've done, and a lot of my colleagues have done, is that we'll go and talk to classes and they will hear a very different perspective. And the first thing I say is, I'm not anti-drugs. So that helps calm people down. And the second thing I say is, I do know people who've been in hospitals and had good experiences. That also helps people calms people down. They're not dealing with a Scientologist here, not just on a, destroy psychiatry rampage, although I do think we should replace psychiatry with something else. And then I tell them my experience. And then I tell them there's a whole movement, and there has been since the beginning of locking people up who were mad. There's been a movement of people, protesting the human rights abuses, and they continue. They continue. There's extreme human rights abuses. I work with people all the time whose lives have almost been destroyed or are in the process of being destroyed by psychiatric treatments, and we have to struggle not just what their problem is, but this additional thing of the treatments on top of the problem. And so there's a lot that needs to be brought in terms of education, in terms of changing. But the psychedelic science and the psychedelic therapy world doesn't talk about any of this. You just go in because you had a really cool experience with psychedelics. Now you want to help people, very valid, but then you get channeled into this world where you're just not aware because there's not an honest conversation. They're not really telling you the whole picture. And then maybe you read something or you come across something on the internet about something called the Hearing Voices movement, or you learn about open dialogue, or you learn about Soteria House. And then you start to research this stuff and you realize, wow, there's all this out there I didn't know anything about. Maybe there was a political aspect to my training. Maybe there's a political aspect to the pharmaceutical industry. They don't really want us to hear about all these different things. They want us to kind of fall into this other framework. And that's a corruption. That's a corruption that's throughout the industry. And it's permeating psychedelic therapy and psychedelic research now.
And I think a big thing that the psychedelic movement is really kind of battling up against, and I just recorded a podcast before this one, but something that got brought up was, when kind of like these casualties happen, it's like, how do we not screw this up, right? We're so close to trying to like change the cultural narrative here. So we can't have these open, honest conversations because it feels like if we come out and talk about it, it's going to screw everything up. Yeah. But, somebody brought up a really great point. The person I was interviewing, there's so many casualties that happen in psychotherapy and psychiatry and drug casualties. And it's like, how much of that is already happening? But I think because of the cultural taboo, psychedelics is kind of dealing with this other beast that we're trying to just get through the stigma and try to re-educate people about it. But, I think that's a huge thing that's also driving it. It's like, how do we keep quiet on certain things so we don't screw it up, right?
Well, there is a double standard. I mean, any new treatment is going to be held to a higher standard of casualties. And you're right. I mean, we get this all the time. People coming off medication sometimes get into trouble and sometimes suicides, but people staying on medications get into trouble or there are suicides, but there's a double standard there. But you're raising something that's very disturbing, because what is the commitment? Is the commitment to get psychedelic drugs accessible at all costs, and we're going to lie, cheat, and steal our way to get there? Or is the commitment to trust that truth is the way, that if we just stick with the truth, that is how we change society. And that's how we are we going to sacrifice the truth? Because there's a lot of institutions in history, I'm thinking of the Catholic Church, that use exactly the same logic. If we let people know about all the serial child rapists in the Catholic Church, that's going to deny people the sanctuary of their religion. People will lose their faith. People will be so hurt because they won't have their local parish to go to, and it'll undermine our charity work and it'll ruin it for everybody. So we have to keep quiet about the shadow because the light is so good. And I think that's a fundamental mistake about how reality works. You don't get any progress through dishonesty. You get progress through what Gandhi called satyagraha. You get progress through truth force by contacting what's true. And what's true is that psychedelics have been used widely in society while they were illegal. People forget this, that people are still using psychedelics. There's no legal psychedelic medicine, but people are still using it. The research shows that the people who use psychedelics in the underground have better mental health, actually lower suicide rates. There's not a giant expansion of the rate of schizophrenia. They're relatively safe drugs. They can benefit a lot of people, and people should have the right to do. And there's a downside. And the society that we're talking about making psychedelics available in has a lot of corruption. And the science is not some, idealistic mission to help discover the truth about nature and reveal the possibilities of the mind. Science is politicized. Science is corrupted. Medicine is politicized and corrupted. So let's be honest about all those things. And then, but the idea, at this point, the psychedelic juggernaut is already rolling down the hill and picking up speed. There's no going back. So I don't think, me blowing the whistle on psychedelic therapy abuse or other people blowing the whistle on, trials that might have been fudged or some of the statistics and data were hidden or something. I don't think that's going to destroy, because it was never about good science. It was about when are the politics and the economics going to line up? And now the politics and the economics have lined up to greenlight psychedelics. And so it's happening. It's not about the science.
Right. If it was about the science, they would have never became illegal again.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So, yeah, it's really interesting. And yeah, we're doing all this peripheral stuff that isn't really helping us get better results. And it probably won't if we're talking about medical psychedelic use. But yeah, like we really are inclined, or I'm personally really inclined to make sure that psychiatry isn't dominating this. And I'd love to see, kind of like a flowering of different use cases and contexts.
Mm-hmm.
Like I would like to see more religious use in a Western context. Like it's great that, white folks want to do Amazonian religion. Like that's cool. But I would like to see people kind of reclaim their own heritage and become a little less alienated in the West by kind of realizing that there's still some cool stuff left in our history. We don't have to always look somewhere else. And
I think in the 80s, there were efforts when the medicalization and science direction was hitting a wall. There were a lot of push to get psychedelics available on religious freedom grounds, that you could, you should be able to use it in a religious context, in a church context, the Native American church with peyote, and it just didn't go anywhere because the politics of it, that there's no economics potentially that could be driving it. But I absolutely agree with you, because I think that these are substances. I mean, alcohol is not a treatment for a disease, but yes, you can have a religious experience on alcohol. You can have an artistic epiphany on alcohol. You can gain courage to go on to ask your date for to marry you on alcohol. Alcohol can mean lots of different things depending on the person who's using it. People are motivated by all kinds of different reasons, some positive, some negative, some gray areas. It's up to the individual. So I think that that's the direction that psychedelics should go, and they should be available. But the meaning of them and the intention and the motivation shouldn't be programmed by an industry and commercialization and psychiatry. It should just be available to people. And then I think it should be curtailed. I don't think there should be massive legalized commercialization and big promotion and giant industries and new synthetic derivatives and these different kind of Frankenstein drugs that we can kind of imagine in science fiction movies. I mean, that's what I'd like to see. And I think that then the conversation's more honest, conversation's more realistic, because what's going to happen is that you're going to start getting people who are going to turn to treatments that have promises, and then they're going to be very disappointed. And we're already seeing this, that people who are using psychedelics for depression or for trauma, or they go do ayahuasca for trauma or something, the effects kind of wear off for some people. And then they have to realize that, wait a second, I really do have to do my work now. Like, say, how am I going to do my work? I'm going to have to clean up my relationships, or I have to change the way that I'm operating my business, or I got to rethink about what my career is all about or who I'm living with. And those are problems that don't get solved by drugs. But if we're honest, we will say, hey, the drugs aren't going to solve these problems, but find out, maybe it'll be helpful, maybe it'll be useful, maybe it'll give a different perspective. I mean, I think that one of the problems is psychedelic exceptionalism, that we think of psychedelics as these sort of magical other kinds of drugs, but they're drugs. They get you high in strange and spectacular and bizarre and unpredictable ways. But yeah, there's a price. You're gonna come down. It's gonna maybe wear off. You're gonna have you might have an incredible experience that motivates you to make lots of life changes, or you might not. You might also find yourself going back over and over again in a destructive way, which some people do with ayahuasca, or they do with psychedelics. You may also find that they get you high, and so you kind of want to stay high. And when you're high, you're kind of in denial. There's people who just start to float on air. They just they're taking drugs, and they're compartmentalizing their lives. They're in denial. They just become enthusiasts, and they're religious for psychedelics, and they're promoting psychedelics, and they can't kind of look at themselves, their shadows, or the part of themselves that they're dissociating from. I think psychedelics can have that quality too. They can have all these qualities, which isn't accounted for if you're just pushing them as depression treatments or anxiety treatments. We're talking about default mode networks.
we're a bit over an hour. Well, I was kind of curious about
Huh?
one point you raised a while back about
Okay.
therapy working. And like, honestly, the talk track that we usually say is something along the lines of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy is typically that getting that much better results than talk therapy, within a few months. But, I don't usually have any good data to say, CBT or other humanistic techniques gets people to where they
Uh-huh.
want to be. So I don't have any figures on that. Like, how do you like to discuss like this therapy working discussion?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned it's interesting that you mentioned cognitive behavioral therapy, because cognitive behavioral therapy is a good example. When it first came out, it made a splash, and a lot of people were like, "Wow, cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR." Is another example. When it first came out, there was a lot of excitement, and then kind of the effectiveness goes down because of the newness goes down. Now, am I going to tell you that cognitive behavioral therapy doesn't help people or EMDR doesn't help people? It does help people. The research on psychotherapy, and again, I would love to see this researched around. So this is the kind of research I think we should be funding around psychedelics, is why does therapy work or why does it not work? The research on psychotherapy says that pretty much all the psychotherapies work or don't work equally. If you go into the world of psychology and psychotherapy, you'll see there's like a million different modalities, pretty much because they all have their adherents, because they all pretty much have some effectiveness. The reason that one will work and another won't work doesn't necessarily tend to be the modality, the kind of treatment. It tends to be these common factors. And the common factors are three things. There's been a lot of research about this. One is the quality of the relationship. If the therapist and the client have a good relationship, if they really feel like there's rapport, and there's different ways to measure this, there's different ways that you can kind of study this and do statistical sampling and kind of collect enough data that you can really say, this is an example of a session where they didn't have a good quality relationship, and this is an example of a session where they did, then that tends to predict, if the quality of the relationship is good between the therapist and the client, it tends to predict that the psychotherapy will be more effective. The second thing is that the therapist is willing to get feedback from the client. This is working, this is not working. They're enlisting the client into a collaborative relating that involves the feedback from the client. That tends to produce higher rates of successfulness in psychotherapy. And the third thing is that the therapist needs to have confidence in what they're doing. And they believe that, yes, I can help. And when I learned about this research, it's called the Heart and Soul of Change research. It's very well known in the world of psychotherapy. When I learned about this, I looked at my own work and I realized, actually, I kind of meet the same criteria. Like I get feedback that it's effective, and sometimes people come to me and it's not useful, it's not helpful, or I make a mistake or whatever. But I tend to do this work because it feels like it's working. And the three factors seem to be present. I spend a lot of time being really related from the very first email to the working out the money. And I don't just ring a bell and say, okay, time to go. I'm very warm about it. Like, hey, we need to wind down the session. Is there more you want to talk about? I'm very because I'm considerate. I really spend a lot of time on relating to people. And if I don't like somebody, I'll find a way to move them to someone else or help them in some other way. But I really have to feel good about the relationship. And then I'm often checking with them like, hey, is this helpful? Like last time we worked on a dream, was that useful for you? I'm really trying to bring feedback into the session. And then the third thing is I'm totally convinced that love is the answer. I'm completely confident that love is what heals. And love is about listening. It's about openness. It's about curiosity. It's all those qualities that we think of as good therapists is love. And I have no doubt that love is the healing force of the universe. So I've kind of fit those three criteria. Now, psychedelic therapists are super strong in the confidence of their technique. And the relationship is also probably really, really good. And they probably have a quality of accepting feedback. The people who've been doing the research and the studies and the RCTs are really highly trained psychotherapists. So they're probably going to, just by the nature of who they are, produce good effectiveness. Now, is it possible that psychedelics, no matter what kind of therapist that introduce psychedelics, overall, you improve the effectiveness of psychedelics? Yeah, I think it's possible. I think it's possible. But is that because of the psychedelics, or is it some other factor? For example, extreme emotional expression. That psychedelic therapy tends to involve crying. It tends to involve maybe getting angry, moving around. Is that the factor? Is it the fact that people are opening up their emotions? If they are, then maybe there's other therapies that also open up their emotions that don't involve psychedelics. Or is it another factor like dealing with an altered state? Like the person is in an altered state when they do psychedelics. Is that a factor? What if we put someone into an altered state using hypnosis? Or we use a non-psychedelic? What if we use alcohol, for example, or cannabis? Maybe I don't think there's been enough research in cannabis-assisted psychotherapy or alcohol-assisted psychotherapy or wilderness psychotherapy. What if it's about an ordeal? You put someone through something where they're afraid of doing something, and then with the trust of a guide, they do it and they survive it. Maybe that has a therapeutic. But I'm not saying this to kind of discount that psychedelics can have an inherent quality in and of themselves that can be beneficial, because I think that lots of people have found that to be true. I'm just saying that we need a lot more critical thinking about this. And we also need to question like why they're beneficial. And if they are beneficial, then how and to the person, because if someone has a religious experience and that helps them with their depression, are we really talking about a medical treatment here? Are we talking about, so the whole thing is sort of squeezed into a medical context. And I really think we need to recognize that it's a much, much broader question and see it in much more broader terms. Does that help you understand? I mean, I don't have the exact answer to that, but I think it's a good direction. If psychedelics do seem to be a good adjunct to therapy, then why not? But I have a thought, which is that, maybe it's a business model that maybe instead of training psychedelic therapists, what if you just train all therapists to deal with psychedelics? That if someone wants to do psychedelics, they do MDMA with their partner, or they find a trip sitter, and then they come in and then they talk about it, and all therapists are learned, because people talk about psychedelic integration as if it's some kind of psychedelic specific therapy, whereas actually, no, you're integrating stuff that comes up. You're integrating the idea of psychedelic therapy itself, I think, is wrong. I think it's psychotherapy where psychedelic experience is an ingredient in it, just like going into the wilderness or meditation. I mean, everybody should be trained in if your client comes to you and they say, yeah, meditation, I had this big meditation experience. Meditation is part of my life. Well, psychotherapists are trained to be curious and to ask common sense questions like, how is it helpful for you? Are you worried about it? Is there a downside? I mean, those are like skills. So someone comes to me and they've had a psychedelic experience. I'm just curious and interested in finding out about it. And they're so wild and they're so unpredictable. And there's so many different kinds of psychedelic experiences that it's not really about the psychedelics. It's about therapy. It's about listening. I'm thinking of someone that I worked with, and she had a really big experience at Burning Man on LSD. And we talked about it. And she said, and this is a lot of people go through this, okay, with psychedelics. We talked about it, and she really got down to the essence of what was her Burning Man experience. And it was that she felt like a kid. I was like, oh, well, what does a kid do? Well, I played. I just spent all day riding the bike, and I was playing, I was dancing. So then I asked a question that's not from psychedelic therapy training, but from therapy training. It's like, well, do you have play in your life? And then she was like, well, actually, I don't play anywhere in my life. And that became for her what she needed to do to get something out of this psychedelic experience. Now, do you need to be a psychedelic therapist to be able to do that with someone's experience? I don't necessarily think so. I think it's just about all the skills and the curiosity and the making connections and the encouraging people to find out, well, why is it that you're feeling free to play on the playa at Burning Man, but you don't feel free to play in your life? Oh, well, my husband's not into it, or I would be embarrassed. Oh, well, why would you be embarrassed? Or, well, okay, get up out of the chair. Let's do some disco dancing right now. Let's start playing in the session right now. Let's, what comes up for you while we're goofing off? And these are just therapy, but you can call it psychedelic integration, but it's basically just working with people using therapy. So I kind of have a feeling that it might be a little bit of a scam, that we're just creating this class of gatekeepers, because it's basically a medical model that if you want to do psychedelics, you got to go with this psychedelic trained therapist, because it's a guild or a marketing thing, that those are the ones who are going to have control over the substances. Where what I've seen is that if you really want to have a very rich psychedelic experience, what I've seen is actually working with someone from your life, like a close friend or your partner or a family member. Wow, because they know you really well. They're familiar with your shadow. I've been trying to get you to look at how judgmental you are, or I've been trying to get you, I've noticed ever since I've known you that you don't really like to have fun. That's something that can cultivate and strengthen a friendship. And so maybe, it's better to actually do those kinds of healing and learning experiences in the community with your friends or with, family members or partners.
It's a radical idea, Will.
Yeah, radical idea. Well, the reality is that people have been doing it for decades.
I know.
We already have. There's so much. I mean, like I said, I'm in California, like MDMA and psilocybin and weed are just it's just part of life. People know that if you have a hard time with your relationship, maybe MDMA is gonna help you. It's just well known. You don't have to wait until it gets illegal. It's just part of the culture. And that's, I think, what we need to build on. And we need to research that rather than turning it into this gatekeeper thing with the psychedelic therapist kind of controlling things.
I think this is why I keep coming back to the religious angle. Like I look at what we've got going in Vermont with Dream Shadow. And I would just like for there to be hundreds of communities like that, where people have this kind of mutual respect, peer support. And we've got the method of transcendence kind of on lockdown. And it's totally legal. And, it's just that repeated exposure to the community support, encouragement, all that kind of stuff. Like that alone seems to be good enough medicine. But you throw in like a tool for like transcendence once in a while, you can come a long way, and communities can really gel. And yeah, like I'd like to mirror or affirm what you said about like couples doing it together, or like community supported stuff. Like I've heard some really great results from that. I've heard some horrible stuff too, but I've largely heard beneficial things.
Well, here's something radical. I mean, if a couple sit together with a friend who's just a silent witness, and they light a candle and they put their hands on their hearts, and each one talks for 15 minutes without the other saying anything, that can be a really powerful experience for couples. If you create the set and the setting of listening and opening the heart, no substance involved, a lot of couples have never done anything like that. It can be very, very powerful. It's a simple couples therapy technique used successfully all over the world. And you don't need a substance to do it. There's no gold rush around it. No one's making money. There's no gatekeeper there. So it's not the kind of thing that society gets excited about. Oh, there's a solution in a pill. This is the new treatment for couples. But what if we lived in a society where we had time? We weren't all working 60 hours a week. We had time and space to talk and communicate and connect about how do couples succeed? What are the tools? What are some good things that we can do? What did you learn? I mean, like your circle, the Dream Shadow Circle sounds like a wonderful. How do we create the context for that to flourish? How does that move forward in society? That's what we need more of. Community, connection.
Yeah. And as you're speaking, it's making me think of an interaction I had not too long ago. Oh, I guess a couple interactions about, thinking about having these really profound psychedelic experiences and coming back. And sometimes the toughest thing about integration, maybe integrating back into the community or your relationships and having very kind of vulnerable conversations. And sometimes I feel like, that's where the work is. And maybe going to a therapist is easier because you don't have that emotional connection and you're able to maybe share things that don't feel as vulnerable as if you were to share to a friend. And yeah, what if like, you did do that work together and really kind of worked on the relationship aspect? Because I think, I don't know, comes back to healing. I always kind of come back to relationship. How are we in relationship with each other? And can we show up being vulnerable and very open? And isn't that the whole goal of what we're sometimes wanting to do with these sessions, is to explore deep emotions? And yeah, it was just interesting. I was having a conversation with a friend, and that's what he was saying. He's like, I feel like most of our conversations have been really superficial, and we have a really actually hard time being vulnerable with each other. And it's like, yeah,
that's
and that's some deep healing when you can get to that point within relationships to be that open, right?
I think you're onto it. I mean, this is the key thing: is that psychedelics in the best of context is the pathway towards that. So why not study that? Why not research that? Why not invest the resources to exploring how we can create contexts for that, what you just described, create more spaces in society for successful encounters and engagements with openness, deeper relatedness, developing more trust, learn to communicate better, learn to form better community bonds, learn to develop our loyalties for each other, overcome our traumas together, tell our stories, overcome our shame, find ways that we can accept each other and support each other. That's what we should be researching. That's what we should be investigating, not psychedelic treatments that might have the effect of this, because this is really what we're after. And that's, I think, one of the great kind of ironies of a lot of the psychedelic experiences, that it does wake you up to that. But now psychedelics are being pulled in a very, very different direction, rather than really the focus is where it should be. But yeah, I think that's one of the reasons that the ayahuasca, I mean, I understand there's a lot of problems with abuse in the ayahuasca community, and there's a lot of dangers and harms that need to be looked at. But this is kind of like a religious revival in the best sense. People are forming community, and they're going to places where they're talking about, some of the best ayahuasca moments are in the drive before and after, coming back and talking with people about really intimate things, and just that feeling of like, hey, we're all humans in this together, and we're all struggling, and hearing other. This also happens in sweat lodges. You're in a sweat lodge and you hear these stories. So-and-so's friend is dying. Someone lost their job. Someone else is really terrified of other people, and they hide in their house. And what are they doing? And just there together. That's what we need to bring back in society, not another treatment to go to the doctor for, another treatment to go to your psychotherapist for. I mean, I am a therapist. I work with people, but I'm doing a lot of work to create these community alternatives. And when someone comes to me, I want to find out why can't they get what they get from me in their life? How do we get it in your life, that you have people to talk to, and a meaningful exploration to go through your trauma with, or ways to find resources?
Well, even just thinking about like the Dream Shadow community, I know multiple times I'm like, wow, like you guys know so much more about me than my small circle of friends or my family. And it's like, isn't that interesting that sometimes we seek that, and it's really actually hard to have that vulnerability and openness within maybe smaller circles that you would expect to be more vulnerable and share deep parts of your life with? I don't know. And maybe that's just me, right? My defense mechanisms, I don't let that
I think it's
open.
Common. It's the biggest thing that is the biggest driver of mental health problems is isolation and lack of connection. So instead of talking about psychedelics as a treatment for depression, why don't we talk about that? We need more connection. We need more vulnerability. We need more intimacy. We need more communion with people in our community. Psychedelics might help that. You might learn how to do that with a trip sitter in a psychedelic session. But the goal, the real prize, is transforming society in the way. And you may not need psychedelics to get there. In fact, if you keep relying on psychedelics, people tend to find out that all their friends are doing psychedelics, and they're kind of doing psychedelics regularly, and they're pretty realizing. And then you reach a point where you're just like, wait a second, I thought I was making progress, but I was going in circles. A lot of people kind of come down. They come down out of a psychedelic high. They come down of a kind of a dissociation where they think that they're getting all these realizations, but there's actually something bigger. And the people around them have been kind of scratching their heads, saying, why does this person seem like, why are they acting like they've discovered the solutions when they actually have been running away from their problems? And psychedelics can have that effect. But if we are developing community and developing connection, then we're also developing accountability and transparency, and we're tapping into the real resource. The real resource is love. The real solution is love. That's the way forward. So for me, everything is about, is it going to enhance that? Is it going to bring more of that into the world? And no, going into a psychotherapy office and doing your individual thing, it may, but really it's about your relationships. It's about your finding the way forward with your family and dealing with your partners and your community and overcoming that isolation. And there's tons of research on the negative effects of that isolation, the disconnection. There's not as much on how to rebuild connection and how to really do it in this society. Because again, I think it comes to the roots of society are rotten. We're in a society that just sells us disconnection and sells us reconnection through a false product. And it's a business model. And as long as there's financial incentive to do that, and as long as we're working 60 hours a week and still don't have health care. So, I mean, I'm a big believer in universal basic income. I would love to see everyone just have, a lot of their basics taken care of. And then we would have the time to do the kinds of things that you're talking about, Kyle, creating these spaces, creating these alternatives, really getting at the problem of how do we reconnect? I mean, there's a lot of preppers. People are preparing for the apocalypse by stockpiling food and weapons and medical supplies. No, that's not how you prepare for the apocalypse. The way you prepare for the apocalypse is you learn how to trust each other. You learn how to open up with each other, how to rely on each other, how to give and receive help, how to tolerate differences, how to build community, how to come together around joint projects, how to deal with people when they're stressed out and freaked out. That's how you prepare for the apocalypse.
We need each other.
Yeah.
Survival of the most compatible.
Yeah.
It's the alternate framing of evolution, I think.
Yeah.
So, I think we'll have to wrap, but I definitely want to do more of these if you're up for it. I think folks really need to hear this stuff, challenge their assumptions about this miraculous set of treatment options, and, think a little bit more deeply about what are the implications of our path here.
Yeah. One thing I would want to leave people, I was talking with someone recently who, he's an old friend of mine. He has had chronic pain, and he's sort of been in a different, parallel track. He didn't really know that much about psychedelics, but then he's sort of saying, well, what if I tried psilocybin? Maybe that would help my chronic pain. And I was talking to him and was talking a lot about harm reduction and honesty and like, hey, yeah, there are some risks, there's lots of benefits, there's a lot of things that you should know. But at the end of the conversation, I found myself telling him, look, it's a very intimate decision and you need a calling. It's like deciding to marry someone or is it a good day to go on that 2-day solo wilderness? You got to really feel deep down that you have a calling, that just something inside of you intuitively says, yeah, this is right for me. I want to try this. And if you have it, then you're willing to say, okay, I made that decision and whatever comes. It's all, I'm just going to all take it as a learning. But if you don't have that, if you're reaching for psychedelics because you're afraid and you've been told that this is what will help you, or you're putting belief or your last chance, or if you don't really feel like you have that intuitive calling, then it's probably not the right thing to do. And I know that sounds very fuzzy and you can't measure that on an intake, but I do kind of really believe that. I feel like it's a very intimate, personal decision. There are outlier risks. There are people that go through a psychedelic journey and their personality changes and they're not going backwards. They're just not, especially young people. And there's some research around developing brains. And I think that is something to really look at, especially for younger people. But I think, it's like any kind of big decisions. I don't think it should be taken lightly. Oh, it's a new depression treatment. No, it shouldn't be taken lightly. And fundamentally, people should be looking very deep to that inner place of their calling and their intuition and feeling like it's the right thing for them to do at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you very much for being here. Could you let people know your websites again?
Yeah. So my website is willhall.net. And I also have more than 180 interviews on a number of different topics related to mental health and psychiatry and alternatives. And there's several about psychedelics. There's one about breath work, and that's at madnessradio.net. And I've written a book. It's a collection of interviews that I did through the Madness Radio podcast, and it's outsidementalhealth.com is where you can find out information about the book. You can also download a free ebook. But I just want to encourage people to find out about the Hearing Voices movement and open dialogue and the sort of the broader alternate reality of the madness movement or the psychiatric survivors movement, because there's a lot there that people are getting interested in psychedelics. They're curious about psychedelics. There's a lot of overlap and bridge building that's needing to happen. And there's a lot of learning that can come in the psychedelics world by going to psychiatric patients, people who've been through a spiritual awakening, who've been diagnosed with schizophrenia and now are on the other side of it and don't take meds. That can be very, very helpful learning for people in the psychedelics world.
Awesome. Thank you, Will. This has been a pleasure. And yeah, hopefully we can do this again sometime soon.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks a lot, guys.
All right. Take care.
All right. Everybody, thanks for listening to Psychedelics Today, and we'll see you on the next episode. Take care.